The TikTok video played on a loop, its upbeat music a stark contrast to the weight pressing on my chest. A mother crouched beside her son, a boy no older than 6, as she tied his shoe and explained why it was important to learn self-reliance. The caption read, "Parents teaching life lessons. Hard now, easy later." I should have just scrolled past. I should have ignored it like any other meaningless video in the flood of content I consumed late at night, but I didn't. Instead, I watched it again, and then again, unable to move my thumb. And just like that, a memory, one I hadn't touched in 20 years, unfolded in my mind like a reopened wound. The summer heat pressing down on my skin, the thick scent of gasoline hanging in the air, sharp and unrelenting. The bitter taste of the cold coffee I had barely sipped, the ice long melted. And then, the sound. The sound that had haunted my nightmares for years. Laughter. My father's deep, guttural chuckle. My mother's softer, breathy giggle. The two of them laughing in perfect harmony as they drove away, leaving me standing in the middle of that dusty gas station parking lot. I blinked hard, the TikTok video finally stopping as my screen went dark. My breath came too fast, my pulse hammering in my throat. The air in my living room suddenly felt stifling, as if I were back in that moment under that same unforgiving sun. I had spent years, decades, locking this away, burying it under the weight of everything I had built. My business, my home, my life. I was not that abandoned girl anymore. I was Maya Carter, owner of Carter Construction. A woman who had clawed her way out of nothing and built something real. But that video had cracked open something inside me, and now, the past was rushing back in, uninvited and unstoppable. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the memory. I could almost feel the rough pavement beneath my sneakers, hear the faint hum of traffic on the highway in the distance. I had been 16. Just 16. We had spent the weekend visiting my older sister, Rachel, at college. A rare trip, one that had felt almost normal. No punishments, no lectures, no cruel lessons disguised as love. I had let my guard down, thinking maybe, just maybe, things were changing. Then, on the way back, my father had pulled into a gas station off I-95. The car had barely stopped when his voice rang out, sharp and impatient. "Go get me a coffee." "No, please." "No, thank you." Just an order, like always. I had obeyed without question. That was the rule. No hesitation. No resistance. Inside, the old coffee machine sputtered and groaned as it brewed a fresh pot. It took longer than I expected. I had stared at the bubbling liquid, my fingers tapping idly against the counter, completely unaware that my life was about to change forever. When I finally stepped back outside, styrofoam cup in hand, the car was gone. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe they had parked somewhere else. Maybe my father had gotten impatient and driven to another part of the lot. Then, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Let's see how long it takes you to get home. Consider this a lesson in problem-solving, smiley face." Even now, reading that message in my mind sent a shiver down my spine. I had stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of it. This had to be another one of their games, one of their twisted lessons. But as I called, over and over, only to be sent straight to voicemail, the truth sank in. They weren't coming back. They had left me. Like I was nothing. Like I had never been theirs. My stomach had twisted, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The world around me felt unreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Then, another text. "Don't bother calling. Your father says you need to figure this out yourself." Something inside me had cracked then. Not just cracked, shattered. I had spent my entire life trying to be good enough for them, bending and breaking under their rules, their punishments, their lessons. I had taken every cruel word, every impossible expectation, and carried them like weights on my back, desperate to be the daughter they wanted. And none of it had mattered. I had never mattered. The memory shifted, blurring, pulling me back to the present. I opened my eyes, my chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. My hands were clenched into fists, my nails digging into my palms. 20 years. 20 years since that day, since I had made the decision that changed everything. I had never gone back. I had never spoken to them again. I had built my life from the ground up, brick by brick, with nothing but my own will and determination. And yet, one random TikTok video had dragged me back to that gas station, back to the helplessness, the betrayal, the raw ache of being discarded like garbage. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to release my fists. This wasn't who I was anymore. I wasn't that lost, abandoned girl. I was a woman who had survived. No, I was a woman who had won. I stood, shaking off the lingering weight of the memory. My coffee sat untouched on the table, growing cold. I grabbed it, took a slow sip, and exhaled. Let the past knock at my door. Let it try to claw its way back in. It wouldn't win. I had already left it behind. And I had no intention of ever looking back. I used to believe that love and cruelty could not coexist. That if someone loved you, truly loved you, they wouldn't make you suffer. But I was wrong. Thomas and Evelyn Carter, my parents, called it tough love. They believed that hardship built strength, that suffering was a necessary tool to shape a person into something worthy. I wasn't their daughter. I was their project. And every mistake, every slip, every moment of imperfection was another reason to break me down and rebuild me in their image. The lessons started young. I was 6 the first time I felt the cold slap of discipline disguised as guidance. It was a simple mistake. I spilled a glass of juice on the kitchen floor. A child's clumsy hands, an accident. But accidents weren't tolerated in our house. My father had yanked me by the wrist, dragged me outside, and told me I could come back in when I learned to be careful. It was November. The first frost had coated the grass in ice. I sat on the porch steps, my tiny fingers turning numb, my breath coming out in shivering gasps. I had cried, of course. Begged to come back inside. My mother had stood by the window, watching me with an expression that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't quite indifference either. Actions have consequences, Maya, she had said through the glass. I don't remember how long I was out there before they let me back in. Maybe an hour. Maybe 2. But I do remember how they acted as if nothing had happened afterward. How my mother set the table for dinner, how my father flipped through the newspaper, how the world inside the house had kept spinning as if I hadn't been left outside in the cold to learn some twisted lesson in responsibility. It didn't end there. By the time I was 10, I understood the rules, the punishments, the way my parents saw the world. At 13, I stopped asking for comfort. At 16, I realized they had never wanted a daughter. They had wanted obedience. The worst punishments weren't the ones that left bruises or welts. They were the ones that sank deeper, that chipped away at my sense of self until I no longer recognized the girl in the mirror. Like the 3 a.m. punishments. Most kids were woken up in the middle of the night by nightmares. I was woken up by my father's voice, sharp and unforgiving. Get up. I never questioned it. I knew better. If I had forgotten to clean my room, left a dish in the sink, or failed to complete some other minor task, it didn't matter that it was the middle of the night. I would scrub floors until my knees ached, clean windows until my arms burned, redo every chore I had ever done that day, while my parents stood over me, their eyes heavy with disappointment. This is what failure feels like, my mother would say as I fought to keep my eyes open. This is how the world works, my father would add. It doesn't care if you're tired. It doesn't care if you're hurting. You either work or you fall behind. I learned to function on exhaustion. I learned that mercy was a foreign concept in the Carter household. And yet, a small part of me, a foolish, desperate part, still wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, they loved me in their own way. That all of this was for something. That maybe one day, they would look at me and see more than just a thing to mold into perfection. But that day never came. The worst of it came in high school. I had been an average student. Not exceptional, but not failing either. But in the Carter household, average was unacceptable. When I came home with AC+ in chemistry, my mother's lips had thinned into a line so tight I thought they might disappear. My father had barely looked up from his newspaper. Fix it, he had said, without emotion. I had nodded, already making a plan to study harder. But that wasn't the lesson they had in mind. That night, I found myself locked outside. It was February. The wind cut through my sweatshirt like knives. The cold seeped into my bones, slow and merciless. I had knocked on the door, called out their names, begged them to let me in. Nothing. Minutes stretched into an hour. My fingers went numb first, then my toes. My breath fogged in the air, shallow and quick. I pressed my forehead against the door, my body trembling, my teeth chattering so hard I thought they might crack. This wasn't about the grade. This was about control. I don't remember when they let me back in. My memory of that night is a blur of cold and exhaustion. I do remember my mother's voice when I stumbled through the door, shivering so hard I could barely stand. Failure has consequences, Maya. I nodded. I understood. I would never be allowed to fail again. They never hit me. Not once. People always assumed they had when I told the stories. That parents this cruel must have used their fists, their belts, their hands. But my parents weren't impulsive. They weren't emotional. Their cruelty was measured, calculated. A strike would have been a moment of anger, a loss of control. But locking your child outside? Leaving them at a gas station? That took planning. And the worst part? It worked. I became everything they wanted. I was disciplined. I was relentless. I worked harder, pushed further, never allowed myself a moment of weakness. I learned how to survive, no matter the cost. And for years, I convinced myself that survival was enough. But now, as I sat in my beautiful home, watching the past unfold like a horror movie I had tried to forget, I realized something. I hadn't just survived. I had escaped. And that was something they had never planned for. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, an unbroken ribbon of asphalt cutting through the trees. The hum of the engine had settled into a steady drone, and the car was thick with silence. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that felt heavy, pressing against my ribs. Rachel had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, her head lolling slightly against the window. She was the golden child, the one who had gotten out first, but for different reasons. She had done everything right, perfect grades, perfect manners, perfect daughter. She had left for college at 18, walking away with their approval, while I had stayed behind. I should have been angry at her for that. Resentful. But I wasn't. Rachel had never been cruel, just distant. Maybe she had learned early on that getting too close to me meant being pulled into my orbit, into the lessons, into the punishments. I shifted in my seat, rolling my shoulders, feeling the tension creep up my spine. My parents sat in the front, my father driving with one hand on the wheel, the other tapping against his thigh. My mother sat straight as a rod, staring at the road ahead as if it personally offended her. The visit had been uneventful. Rachel had taken us around campus, shown us her dorm, introduced us to her friends. My parents had smiled, nodded, performed their role as proud parents. But I knew better. The whole weekend had been a test. Would I embarrass them? Would I step out of line? Would I say something that made them regret bringing me along? I hadn't. I had been perfect. And still, I knew it wouldn't be enough. It never was. The sun was starting to set when my father cleared his throat. We need gas. He pulled off at the next exit, steering the car into a worn-down station off I-95. The kind of place with faded signs and a single flickering light above the pumps. There was a small convenience store attached, the kind that smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner. My father rolled to a stop and put the car in park. Then, without looking at me, he said the words that would change my life. Go get me a coffee. I was used to orders. They were as natural as breathing. I grabbed my wallet and pushed open the door, stepping out into the heat. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of gasoline. I wiped the sweat from the back of my neck and made my way inside. The store was nearly empty. A man in a trucker hat stood by the refrigerated section, and the cashier, a bored-looking teenager, scrolled on his phone behind the counter. I walked to the coffee machine, but the pot was nearly empty, the liquid at the bottom burnt and thick. I sighed, hitting the button to start a new brew. I waited. It took longer than I expected. I stared at the slow drip of coffee, my fingers tapping against the counter. My thoughts wandered. School. Work. the pile of laundry I had left undone. And then, a sound cut through the hum of the machines. The roar of an engine. A car pulling away. I turned, frowning, stepping toward the door. And then I saw it. Their car. Leaving. I pushed through the door, stepping into the sweltering heat, the coffee long forgotten. "Mom?" My voice came out uncertain, hesitant. "Dad?" The car didn't slow. Didn't turn around. And then, just before it disappeared onto the highway, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Let's see how long it takes you to get home. Consider this a lesson in problem-solving," smiley face. My stomach dropped. The world around me shrank, the edges of my vision narrowing until all I could see was that single message. My fingers tightened around my phone, my breath coming too fast. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. Another text. "Don't bother calling. Your father says you need to figure this out yourself." A sharp, hot crack ran through my chest. A lesson. A fucking lesson. They had left me. I stood there, frozen, as the realization settled like lead in my stomach. I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of where I was. A gas station in the middle of nowhere. No familiar landmarks. No way home. Panic clawed at my throat. I tried calling, my fingers trembling. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. Again. Again. I lowered the phone, my breath shaking. The sky was darkening, the last light of day slipping below the horizon. I could hear the buzz of insects, the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I was 16. I had no way home. And they weren't coming back. Something inside me cracked. Not just cracked, shattered. A part of me had always known, deep down, that my parents didn't love me. Not really. But I had clung to the hope, to the scraps of kindness they occasionally threw my way. This was proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. I was nothing to them. I swallowed hard, forcing my body to move. My hands were still shaking as I checked my wallet. $140 in cash. My emergency money from my summer job. Enough for a bus ticket. I could go home. I could beg them to take me back. Or, my fingers hovered over my contacts. There was only one other number I could call. Aunt Linda. I hadn't seen her in years. She and my mother had fought when I was younger, and after that, she had simply disappeared from my life. My mother always said it was because Linda was weak. Too soft. That she wouldn't understand the way real parenting worked. Maybe that was exactly why I needed to call her. I pressed dial. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then, "Maya." Linda's voice was groggy, confused. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" My throat tightened. "I need help." Silence. Then, her voice softened. "Where are you?" I gave her the address. She didn't ask why. She didn't hesitate. "I'm getting you a bus ticket. There's a cab service nearby, I'll call them for you. They'll take you to the station." My breath hitched. Just like that? Just like that. I closed my eyes, relief crashing into me so hard it almost hurt. For the first time in my life, someone wasn't asking me to prove I deserved kindness. I gripped the phone tighter. "I don't want to go back." "You don't have to," Linda said firmly. "You come to me, okay? You're not alone anymore." The weight of the world lifted from my shoulders. I turned toward the highway, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. They had left me. But I wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. The bus station was quieter than I expected. The air was thick with the stale scent of fried food and cheap coffee, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows across the worn tile floor. I sat on one of the hard plastic benches, gripping my ticket like it was a lifeline. My hands were still shaking. I could barely feel my fingers. My entire body buzzed with a nervous energy I couldn't shake, a strange mix of adrenaline, fear, and something else, something unfamiliar. Freedom. The word whispered through my mind, but I wasn't ready to believe it yet. The past hour had been a blur. After I hung up with Aunt Linda, everything had moved fast. The cab she sent arrived within 15 minutes, a beaten-up yellow sedan with an elderly driver who smelled like peppermints. He didn't ask questions. He just took my name, nodded, and started driving. I had watched the gas station disappear through the window, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might break my ribs. With every mile that passed, I had expected something to stop me. A phone call. A message. My parents changing their minds. But there had been nothing. Not a single call. Not a single attempt to get me back. Because they weren't coming for me. Not now. Not ever. I clenched my fists, forcing the shaking in my hands to stop. I was here. I had a ticket. I had a way out. That was all that mattered. The ticket in my hand read, Richmond, Virginia. One way. One way. There was no return trip. I had made my choice. A tired voice crackled through the station's old speakers, announcing the departure of the next bus. My bus. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady as I walked toward the loading area. The bus was old, its white paint faded and peeling, the windows streaked with dirt. A few other passengers were already in line, an older woman in a floral dress, a man in a baseball cap, a teenage boy with headphones so big they covered half his face. I kept my head down as I handed my ticket to the driver, an older man with kind eyes and a slow, deliberate way of moving. Richmond, huh? He said, tearing the ticket and handing back the stub. Yeah, I murmured. Family there? I hesitated. Something like that. He nodded, as if he understood more than I had said, and gestured for me to board. I climbed the steps, moving toward the middle of the bus. Most of the seats were empty. I slid into one near the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. The world outside was dark, the parking lot illuminated only by the buzzing yellow glow of an old streetlight. I exhaled slowly. I was leaving. Actually leaving. The doors hissed shut. The bus lurched forward. And just like that, I was gone. The ride was long. Hours passed in silence, interrupted only by the occasional snore from one of the passengers or the muffled hum of the bus's engine. I couldn't sleep. I had expected exhaustion to pull me under the moment I sat down, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents' car disappearing onto the highway. I saw my mother's text, cold and detached, treating my abandonment like a game. Consider this a lesson in problem-solving, smiley face. I swallowed hard, shoving the memory back down. I wouldn't let them haunt me. Not anymore. Instead, I pulled out my old iPod, the one thing I had managed to grab before leaving the gas station. It was scratched and outdated, but it still worked. I scrolled through the playlists, landing on one I had made years ago, songs I had listened to late at night when I needed to escape, if only in my mind. I pressed play. The soft strumming of a guitar filled my ears, and for the first time since stepping on this bus, I let my muscles relax. The past was behind me. The future was uncertain. But for the first time in my life, the present was mine. Dawn was breaking by the time the bus rolled into Richmond. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and gold, the city just beginning to wake. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional passing car or the distant bark of a dog. As the bus pulled into the station, I felt my stomach tighten. This was it. No turning back. I grabbed my backpack and stepped off the bus, the warm Virginia air wrapping around me like a strange, unfamiliar embrace. And then I saw her. Aunt Linda. She stood a few feet away, scanning the crowd. She looked older than I remembered, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with years of worry. But her eyes were the same. Warm, gentle. She spotted me, and her face softened. Maya. My throat closed up. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear my name spoken with kindness until now. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. A real hug. Not a stiff, obligatory embrace. Not the cold, calculated touch of someone performing affection. A real, genuine hug. And for the first time since that gas station, since the moment my parents left me behind, I let myself cry. The ride to Linda's house was quiet. She didn't push me to talk. Didn't demand answers. She just let me sit there, staring out the window, letting the reality of everything settle. Her house was small but cozy, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile home I had grown up in. The moment we stepped inside, the scent of cinnamon and coffee wrapped around me, warm and inviting. She gestured toward the couch. Make yourself at home. I hesitated. I didn't know what home was supposed to feel like. But I sat down anyway. Linda disappeared into the kitchen, returning a moment later with 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to me, then settled into the armchair across from me. She studied me for a moment, her gaze unreadable. I don't know what happened, she finally said, her voice gentle. But I know Thomas and Evelyn, and I know that whatever it wasn't your fault. My chest tightened. I had spent my entire life being told otherwise. That everything was my fault. That if I had just been better, if I had just tried harder, maybe things would have been different. I looked down at the tea in my hands, my fingers tightening around the warm ceramic. For years, I had been surviving. But now, for the first time, I had a chance to live. And I wasn't going to waste it. The sharp ring of my phone cut through the steady hum of my office. I barely glanced at it, too focused on reviewing the latest budget report for my construction firm. The numbers had to be airtight, cost overruns were the enemy. But the ringing didn't stop. Then another. And another. I frowned. My personal phone, which rarely saw much activity, lit up with a flood of missed calls. Rachel. The sight of her name sent a strange jolt through my chest. We hadn't spoken in years. Not because we had fought, but because distance had made us strangers. But now, she was calling. And she wasn't the only one. The list of missed calls grew, some from unknown numbers. My stomach twisted as I hesitated, then finally swiped to voicemail. A single message from Rachel. Her voice was breathless, urgent. Maya, please pick up. Mom and Dad found you. They're spiraling. Just call me. I stared at the phone. I had buried them. Or at least, I thought I had. For 20 years, I had built walls so thick, so impenetrable, that nothing about them could reach me. I had changed my number, moved cities, built a life that had nothing to do with them. But they had found me. My fingers hovered over Rachel's name. Then, before I could decide, another voicemail came through. Not from Rachel. From them. My pulse thundered in my ears. I didn't want to listen. But I did. My mother's voice came first, sickly sweet. Maya, honey, please. Your mother is sick. We just want to talk. A pause. Then my father's voice, slurred and sharp. You think you're better than us with your fancy business? We made you who you are. A deep rage curled inside me. Made me? They had left me. Another message. We made one mistake, and you abandoned us. I nearly laughed. One mistake. One, as if my entire childhood hadn't been a long, drawn-out exercise in cruelty. As if they hadn't left me on the side of the road like trash. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. They weren't calling because they missed me. They wanted something. And I had a sick feeling I already knew what it was. I called Rachel back. She answered on the first ring. Maya, she breathed. God, I didn't think you'd. What do they want? I cut her off, my voice colder than I intended. Rachel hesitated. Can we meet? In person? I nearly refused. I nearly told her that I didn't care, that I didn't need to hear whatever justification she was about to give. But this was Rachel, the only family member who had ever shown me kindness. So I took a slow breath and said, fine. Tomorrow morning. Denny's. Alone. The next day, I arrived first. Denny's wasn't my usual spot, but it felt neutral. A place that didn't belong to either of us. Rachel walked in 10 minutes later, looking the same but different. Older. More tired. She slid into the booth across from me, twisting her hands together like she wasn't sure how to start. I didn't offer any comfort. Instead, I lifted my coffee and said, talk. She sighed. They're in trouble. I didn't react. She kept going. They're losing the house. Dad's gambling got out of control. Mom racked up credit card debt. They remortgaged, but now the bank's coming for them. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting her words settle. They found your company online, Rachel continued, her voice soft. They know you're doing well. They think I'll save them. Rachel looked down. I set my cup down with a quiet clink. Let me get this straight, I said. my tone calm. They left me at a gas station. They never looked for me. Never called. Never apologized. And now, because they ruined their own lives, they suddenly remember they have a daughter. Rachel flinched. They're desperate, Maya. So was I said, voice like steel. Rachel swallowed hard. I know, and I'm not excusing them. But they're still. Still what? I cut in, my voice sharp. Family? Rachel didn't answer. And that told me everything I needed to know. She still wanted their approval. Even after everything. I leaned back in my seat. You're free to help them if you want. But I won't. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. You could change everything for them. I gave her a humorless smile. So could they. By being better people. Rachel wiped at her eyes, staring down at the table. I took out my wallet and tossed some cash onto the check. Block their number, I told her. It'll make life easier. Then I stood and walked away. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of old ghosts and fresh anger. They had found me. They thought I owed them something. They thought they could use me. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to calm. If they wanted to play games, then I'd play too. But on my terms. I picked up my phone and made a call. Not to them, but to my lawyer. By morning, I would own their house. And in 30 days, they'd be the ones left with nothing. I arrived at my office early, long before my employees filtered in. The city was just beginning to stir, streetlights flickering off, the hum of traffic slowly increasing as the sun began its slow rise. I sat at my desk, fingers steepled, thinking. I had spent my life learning how to survive. Now, I was going to teach them what that meant. By mid-morning, I had everything I needed. I called my lawyer, ran the necessary checks, and within hours, the deed to my parents' house was mine. It was almost too easy. Years of neglect, late payments, and mismanaged finances had made it simple to acquire their debt, wrap it up in a tight little bow, and claim ownership. The house, the same one where I had learned fear, where I had been conditioned to believe I was worthless, was now in my hands. By the time the ink dried, I had already planned my next move. I texted Rachel. Meet me at Denny's. Alone. 7 a.m. This time, I didn't expect her to arrive. The next morning, Rachel walked in right on time. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. She slid into the booth across from me, her shoulders hunched forward, her hands gripping a cup of coffee she had picked up on the way. I studied her for a moment. She had always been the good one, the compliant one. She had gotten out by being perfect. I had gotten out by being discarded. Now we were here. She let out a slow breath. What is this about, Maya? I pulled a folder from my bag and placed it in front of her. She frowned, hesitating before opening it. Her eyes scanned the documents, her breath hitching as she reached the final page. The house, she whispered. You bought it? I took a sip of my coffee, nodding. Yes. She blinked, her expression shifting between shock and disbelief. You're helping them? I laughed. A short, dry sound. No, Rachel, I said, voice smooth as glass. I'm evicting them. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She glanced at the papers again, flipping through them, her hands trembling. They have 30 days to vacate, I continued. After that, the house is getting demolished. Rachel's head snapped up. Maya, you can't. I can, I corrected. And I am. Tears filled her eyes. You don't have to do this. I tilted my head, considering her words. She still didn't get it. Rachel had spent her life bending, breaking herself to fit into their mold, clinging to the scraps of their love. She had been their puppet, their pride. She had never been their victim. I leaned forward, my voice low, steady. I do have to do this, I said. Because they never faced consequences. Not once. They destroyed me, Rachel. And when I left, they went on like nothing happened. Like I never existed. Rachel flinched. I want them to feel it, I continued. I want them to know what it's like to have their lives ripped away. I want them to understand that they can't always win. Rachel swallowed hard. And what happens when they're homeless? When they have nowhere to go? I shrugged. Not my problem. She shook her head. tears slipping down her cheeks. "You're just like them." For a moment, I felt something tighten in my chest. But then I let it go. Rachel didn't understand. She couldn't understand. I stood, grabbing my coat. "I paid for breakfast," I told her. "Enjoy it." Then I walked out. By the afternoon, the news had reached them. I knew because my receptionist called. "There's an older couple here," she said hesitantly. "They're insisting they're your parents." I smiled coldly. Showtime. I walked to the glass wall of my office and looked down at the reception area. There they were. Thomas and Evelyn Carter. My parents. They looked smaller than I remembered. The years hadn't been kind. My father's hair had thinned, his once commanding presence dulled by age and bad choices. My mother stood beside him, clutching a cheap purse, her face a perfect mask of anguish. She was crying. Of course, she was. I watched them for a moment, savoring it. Then I turned to my receptionist. "Let them in." She hesitated. "Are you sure?" I nodded. She pressed a button, and the glass doors unlocked with a soft click. My parents stepped inside. The moment my mother saw me, she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh, Maya," she sobbed. "Look at you. You're all grown up." My father stood stiffly beside her, his jaw clenched. I folded my arms. "State your business," I said, voice emotionless. "Or leave." My mother's face crumpled. "Maya, please." "Cut the act," I snapped. "What do you want?" She sniffled, glancing at my father. He sighed heavily, stepping forward. "We need help," he admitted. "You owe us." I raised an eyebrow. "I owe you?" He nodded, completely serious. "We raised you," he continued. "Fed you. Clothed you. And now, when we need you, you're just going to throw us away." I let out a slow breath. Then, I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the deed to their house. "Funny you should mention that house," I said, sliding the paper across the desk. "Because it's not yours anymore." They both stared at it, uncomprehending. Then, my mother's hand flew to her chest. What is this?" "The house," I said, my tone almost lazy. "I own it now. You have 30 days to vacate. After that, it's getting demolished." My father's face darkened. "You wouldn't." I smiled. "Oh, I would." My mother let out a wail, her hands shaking as she clutched my father's arm. "You can't do this," she sobbed. "We're your parents." "No," I said, standing. "You were my wardens." My father slammed his fist on the desk. "You'll regret this." I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "No," I whispered. "You will." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then, without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving them behind, just like they had left me. The office was quieter than usual after my parents left. My receptionist, Emily, peered into my office with a look of concern, but I waved her away before she could say anything. I wasn't in the mood for sympathy. Instead, I sat down at my desk, exhaling slowly as I stared at the deed to the house. The house I had once been trapped in. The house that no longer belonged to them. My phone buzzed. "Rachel." I let it go to voicemail. Then it buzzed again. And again. By the time I checked, there were 5 missed calls and a single text. "Rachel. Maya, they know. They're calling everyone. You need to prepare yourself." I closed my eyes, rubbing my temples. I should have known they wouldn't just accept their fate quietly. They weren't the type. That night, the calls started. Not from Rachel. Not from my parents. From relatives. Aunts. Uncles. Cousins I barely remembered. Some calls were subtle, thinly veiled attempts at guilt-tripping. "Oh, Maya, sweetheart, your mother told me she's sick. How could you turn your back on her?" Some were outright angry. "You heartless little bitch, they raised you. They gave you everything and this is how you repay them?" I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Because I had receipts. I pulled up old emails, saved text messages, even an audio recording from the day I was locked outside in the freezing cold at 16, begging to be let in while my mother's voice filtered through the door, calm, detached. "Actions have consequences, Maya." I took everything, the messages, the proof of their cruelty, the evidence of the life I had survived, and sent it in one massive email to every relative who had called. The subject line? The truth. Then I put my phone on silent and went to sleep. By morning, the fallout had begun. My inbox was flooded with messages, some apologizing, some stunned into silence. But the damage was done. The truth was out. And my parents? Their carefully curated web of lies had finally crumbled. It wasn't enough for me to win. They had to lose. And I was going to make sure of it. 2 days later, I drove to the house. Their house. My house. A large moving truck was parked in the driveway, a few workers carrying out furniture, loading it in with the efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times before. And in the middle of it all, my parents. My mother sat on the porch, her face blotchy from crying, her hands trembling as she watched strangers dismantle her life. My father stood nearby, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight with barely concealed rage. When he saw me step out of the car, his face turned red. "You did this." I shrugged. "I did." His lips curled. "You're a monster." I tilted my head. "And what does that make you?" He didn't answer. My mother finally lifted her head, her eyes pleading. "Maya, please." Her voice cracked. "We're your parents. We made mistakes, but we're family." "Family?" I laughed, the sound bitter. "You left me at a gas station and never looked back. You let me freeze outside in the winter. You broke me down until there was nothing left." Her face crumpled. The demolition was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. I arrived an hour early. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of overcast that promised rain but never delivered. The air was thick with anticipation. Across the street, a few curious neighbors had gathered, whispering behind their hands, sneaking glances at me. They remembered. They remembered the fights, the screaming, the nights when I had been locked outside in the cold. They remembered my father's voice cutting through the walls, my mother's silence sharp as a blade. And now, they would remember this. I stepped out of my car, a coffee in hand, and took my place near the demolition crew. My parents were there, of course. They stood on the sidewalk, looking like people who had lost everything. Because they had. My mother clutched her purse like it was the only thing tethering her to this world, her face streaked with dried tears. My father stood rigid beside her, his fists balled at his sides, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. The past few weeks had not been kind to them. No one had taken them in. No family members had offered them a home. They had burned too many bridges, and now they were stranded, alone, with nothing. I wondered if they had spent their nights in cheap motels, if they had tasted the bitterness of sleeping in their car, the same way I had once stood outside this house, begging to be let in. But I didn't ask. I didn't care. I took a slow sip of my coffee and turned my gaze to the house. It looked smaller than I remembered. Less of a fortress. Less of a monster. Just a building. For walls, a roof, a collection of bricks and wood and memories that I no longer needed. The head contractor approached, clipboard in hand. "We're ready when you are." I nodded. He lifted his hand, signaling to the crew. Engines roared to life. Machines moved forward. My parents realized, in that moment, that I wasn't bluffing. My mother let out a broken sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Maya, please." I didn't look at her. I had spent years begging them to care. Now it was their turn to beg. And I had nothing left to give. The first strike hit. The sound of splintering wood filled the air. The second strike followed, a deep, shuddering crack that echoed through the empty space where our family had once pretended to exist. The walls crumbled. The past crumbled with them. My father let out a sharp breath, his shoulders sagging. He had lost. They had lost. And I was free. By the time the dust settled, the house was nothing but rubble. I stood there, watching as the machines moved in to clear the debris. The wind carried the last remnants of my childhood away, scattering it like ashes. It was over. A camera crew had shown up halfway through the demolition, some local news station, drawn in by the drama of it all. The fall of a family. The ultimate revenge. The perfect story. I didn't speak to them. I didn't need to. The internet had already done the work for me. After I exposed my parents' cruelty, the story had spread. People had seen the messages, the recordings, the truth. And now, they watched as the final chapter unfolded. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, another flood of messages, another wave of reactions. I ignored them. Instead, I turned to the lead contractor. Make sure the foundation is completely removed, I told him. I don't want a single piece of this place left standing. He nodded. Understood. I exhaled. For the first time in my life, I could breathe. Really, truly breathe. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights stretching out beyond my window. My phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't a stranger. It was Rachel. I hesitated before answering. Hey, I said. There was a pause. Then, I saw the footage. I waited. You really did it, she whispered. I did. Another pause. Then, softer. Are you okay? I hadn't expected that question. I closed my eyes, considering it. Was I okay? I had spent my entire life carrying the weight of my parents' cruelty. I had spent years pretending I was fine, that I didn't need closure, that I didn't need to see them suffer the way I had suffered. But now, the weight was gone. And I felt lighter. Not happy. Not sad. Just free. I think so, I said finally. Rachel let out a slow breath. I know we're not close, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here. I blinked. Rachel had never been cruel to me, but she had never really been there, either. She had escaped their wrath by playing by their rules, by being perfect, by leaving first. But now, for the first time, she was reaching out. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to meet her halfway. Thanks, I murmured. For once, I meant it. We sat in silence for a few moments, neither of us sure how to navigate this new version of our relationship. Then Rachel cleared her throat. So, what's next? Next. I glanced at the blueprints on my desk, the plans for the lot where my parents' house had stood. The land was mine now. And I wasn't turning it into luxury condos. I wasn't selling it to the highest bidder. I was building something new. A haven. A place for kids like me. For people who had been discarded, abandoned, left to fend for themselves. A place where no one had to learn survival the hard way. I'm building something, I said. Rachel hesitated. What kind of something? A home, I murmured. The name was already decided. Annabelle Haven. Named after the only person who had ever given me one. Aunt Linda. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she whispered, I think she would have been proud of you. My throat tightened. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that. I ended the call and leaned back in my chair, staring out at the city, at the world stretching before me. I had won, but more importantly, I had survived. And now? Now, I was going to make sure no one else had to learn survival the way I did. Because this was how you break the cycle. The construction site smelled of fresh earth and sawdust. The lot where my childhood home had once stood was now nothing more than dirt and steel beams, the foundation of something new beginning to take shape. It had been a month since the demolition. A month since my parents had been forced to walk away with nothing. A month since I had made the final choice to turn this place into something that mattered. And yet, standing here, watching the first real signs of progress, I still felt the weight of it all. Annabelle Haven. That was what this place would be. A safe space for kids who had nowhere else to go. For people who had been abandoned, cast aside, or told they weren't worth saving. A small development of affordable housing, funded by the very success that my parents had once belittled. Poetic, really. I crossed my arms as I surveyed the work, the hum of machinery filling the air. My foreman, Jason, stepped up beside me, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. We're on track, he said, nodding toward the steel frames rising from the ground. If we keep this pace, we'll be ready for the first families in 6 months. I nodded. Good. Jason hesitated, then shot me a sidelong glance. You sure about this? I raised an eyebrow. He let out a dry chuckle. I mean, I know you've got the money for it. But you're not making a profit here, Maya. I smirked. Not everything is about profit. He exhaled through his nose, nodding. Yeah, I guess I just didn't take you for the charity type. I didn't take myself for that either once. But this wasn't charity. It was justice. I had spent my entire childhood learning that the world didn't care if you were hurting, that survival was something you had to figure out on your own. I wanted to build a place where that wasn't the case. Jason clapped me on the shoulder before heading back to oversee the crew. I stayed behind, watching as the workers moved like clockwork, lifting beams, measuring supports, pouring concrete. This was happening. It was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something unfamiliar curl in my chest. Hope. That night, I sat in my apartment, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at my laptop screen. The headlines still floated around. Daughter of ex-parents who abandoned her, then destroys their house. Family drama or ultimate revenge. The internet reacts. The world had taken sides. Some called me heartless. Others called me a hero. I didn't care what they thought. I had done what I needed to do. A notification popped up at the corner of my screen, an email from Rachel. I hesitated, then clicked it open. Subject: I get it now. Maya. I used to think you were cruel. I thought that because I wasn't the one they hurt. Not really. I was the good daughter. The obedient one. And for a long time, I believed that if I just kept being that person, they would love me the way they were supposed to. But they never did they? Not really. And now that they have no one left, I see them for what they are. They don't want love. They want control. I don't know if we'll ever be close, but I'm proud of you. For walking away. For choosing something better. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Rachel. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. Rachel had spent her whole life clinging to them, chasing the approval they had dangled like a prize she would never win. Now, she had finally let go. I stared at the email for a long time. Then, for the first time since we were kids, I replied. Subject: maybe one day. A week later, I stood in front of the construction site with a microphone in my hand. The grand opening was months away, but today was the announcement. The reveal. Behind me, the skeletal frames of the building stood tall against the afternoon sky. I adjusted the mic, scanning the small crowd, reporters, local officials, a few curious residents. I cleared my throat. I spent my childhood learning what it meant to be unwanted, I began. I learned that sometimes, the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. Murmurs rippled through the audience. I continued. My parents believed in tough love. But love isn't something that needs to be proven through suffering. Love is safe. Love is kind. Love is earned through actions, not demanded through control. I glanced at the construction site behind me. This land belonged to my parents. And they used it to raise a child they didn't want. I looked back at the crowd. So now, I'm turning it into a home for the ones who do deserve love. The ones who need a second chance. A fresh start. I lifted the small sign in my hand and set it onto the post behind me, unveiling the name. Annabelle Haven. Named after my aunt, who was the first person to show me that kindness isn't weakness. Applause rang out. Cameras flashed. I stepped back, letting the moment settle. I wasn't doing this for attention. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing this to break the cycle. To take something rotten and make it whole. To prove, once and for all, that I had won. And that my past no longer defined me. Later that night, as I sat on my apartment balcony with another glass of whiskey, I let myself breathe. For the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving. I was living. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Rachel's number. For a long moment, I hovered over it. Then, finally, I hit call. She picked up on the second ring. Maya. I exhaled. Hey. A pause. Then, hey. I smiled. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. The wind carried the last traces of dust through the construction site, swirling between the steel beams and the fresh concrete. Annabelle Haven was no longer just a concept or a set of blueprints. It was real. I stood in the middle of the nearly finished housing complex, the skeletal structures beginning to take shape into actual homes. In a few months, Families, real families, would live here. Kids would grow up in a place where they wouldn't be punished for simply existing. I exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle in my bones. This was closure. Not the kind where you forgive and forget. Not the kind where you make peace with the people who wronged you. This was my closure. I had rewritten the ending to a story that had tried to define me. Now, I was the author. And my past? It had no say in what came next. The demolition of my childhood home had gone viral. People were obsessed with the story: abandonment, revenge, justice. The internet devoured it. Some called me ruthless. Others called me inspiring. I didn't care about either. But what I hadn't expected was how many people reached out. Emails, messages, comments. People who had been abandoned. People who had been hurt. People who had grown up in houses that were never homes. They told me their stories. They told me they wished they had done what I did. And some told me they couldn't. Because they were still stuck. Still trapped. Still waiting for someone to say, "You don't have to go back." So I answered them. Not all of them, because there were too many. But enough. Enough to let them know they weren't alone. And that sometimes, the only way to break the cycle is to walk away and never look back. A week before the grand opening of Annabelle Haven, Rachel called. We had been talking more. Not often. Not like sisters who had always been close. But like two people who were finally starting to understand each other. "I want to be there," she said. "For the opening." I hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." She paused. "Maya, I know I never really saw things the way you did. But I do now. And I just—" "You don't have to say it," I cut in. But she did anyway. "I'm sorry." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I know," I said quietly. And for the first time, I actually believed her. The day of the opening, I stood on a small stage in front of the finished homes. The buildings were simple, but sturdy. Bright, open spaces. Clean lines. A place meant to be lived in. People filled the lot, local officials, families who had already been approved to move in, reporters still milking the last bit of drama from my story. And Rachel. She stood in the front, arms crossed, watching me like she wasn't sure whether to be proud or overwhelmed. I adjusted the microphone, took a slow breath, and spoke. Most people don't get to choose the family they're born into. A murmur ran through the crowd. They knew my story. That was why they were here. But we can choose what we do with what we were given. I glanced over the homes behind me, feeling the weight of the moment settle in my chest. I chose to build something new. Something better. A place where no one has to prove they deserve kindness. A pause. Then, I reached down and lifted the sign that would stand at the entrance of the community. Annabelle Haven. Named after the only person who ever gave me a home when I had none, I finished. The crowd clapped. Some people cheered. Rachel wiped at her eyes. And I just stood there, letting it all wash over me. Because I had won. Not just against my parents, but against everything they had tried to make me believe about myself. I had survived. And now, I was doing more than that. I was living. The night after the opening, I sat on my balcony, looking out at the city's skyline. The glow of streetlights cast long shadows, and the hum of traffic buzzed in the distance. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from Rachel. "Rachel, proud of you." I stared at the words for a long moment before replying. "Me. You should come visit." There was a pause. Then, "Rachel, I'd like that." I set my phone down, exhaling. For the first time in a long time, the past didn't feel like a weight around my neck. It felt like something I had finally outrun. And the future? For once, it was mine. Completely.